Generals, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce our former Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, KNEISSL. He had promised to speak to us at this conference. I already explained what the purpose of this conference is, what we want to achieve. With it, we want to start a journey along the path of education and training. We want to offer students and future leaders to make them available to make use of appropriate counseling and advice before they need to take decisions. Of course, it's always difficult to put such approaches into practice, but if you are being supported by people such as the former minister, this shows that you're on the right track. Minister KNEISSL was not just approached by us because she was at the time the acting minister, but also because of her obvious and undisputed expertise in the field, and she has accepted. And with that, I would like to thank her and hand over to her.
Ja, sehr geehrte
Dear gentlemen, dear generals, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear interpreters, I hope that you can hear me and that I'm speaking slow enough so that you can translate everything to English. Dear Brigadier Wolfgang Peischl, Editor-in-Chief of the Austrian Military Journal, I already said it last year and I would like to repeat it again this year with the same level of commitment. It is always a pleasure and an honor to be here in this Sala Terrena of the National Defense Academy that I owe a lot to. The general topic is the will. So the will to negotiate, the will to talk. What does it mean for the work of a diplomat? After 18 months at the helm of the diplomatic apparatus, I have now resigned from my activity and I have been able to update some of my knowledge, and also found out more about what has changed in the era of diplomacy since I left the diplomatic service in autumn of 1998. And these insights and these opinions will be shared with you in the following, and I'm looking forward to an exchange of ideas. As a little footnote, in 2014 and 15, I had a manuscript in my computer. I couldn't find a publisher for a long time because the subject of diplomacy is a bit too cumbersome for some publishers in a day and age where non-fiction books focus on how-to books. And then I found a scientific publisher in Germany who was interested, and now a lot needs to be updated. I didn't have the time in 2016 and 17, but now I'm in the midst of working on that publication, and it is always very helpful and conducive to not only sit at one's desk, but also have a lively exchange with an audience such as this one. Now, what are the three main tasks of working as a diplomat? The way it has crystallized over the centuries. And I'm not going to go back to the beginnings of diplomacy, whether we're talking about the Greek city-states or the Italian city-states. And whenever we had multipolar circumstances, diplomacy experienced a boom. And whenever there was an imperial era, such as the Roman Empire, or maybe other eras of characterized by a monopolar structure, diplomacy tended to be forgotten. But there were always periods of boom at whenever there was a multipolar structure and the Greek city-states entered into peace treaties, peace negotiations, armistices were negotiated, envoys, missions. So there were no permanent envoys, but mobile envoys. So we went through different stages of the boom experienced by diplomacy in the past 2 centuries. We had the resident military apparatus, the military envoys, and this audience is characterized by mostly members of the military. So when Otto von Bismarck was the chief diplomat of the new German Empire in 1871, and when he was supposed to set up a diplomatic apparatus in the Wilhelmstrasse that hadn't existed like that in the past, because the Kingdom of Prussia had a relatively minor staff of envoys, no resident ones, and he found it very difficult to select candidates. So the average German young man didn't want to go for a diplomatic career. They tended to join the military, so it wasn't attractive enough. So in the 1880s, in this new German empire, they focused on the military career, but not diplomacy, where patience and where working behind the scenes is required. And 20 years ago, Jean-Yves Klein, a French US-American general, came up with a wonderful definition of preventive diplomacy, saying, for preventive diplomacy, you don't get a Medal of Valor. And when it comes to diplomacy, I think the word preventive could be omitted, because only successful diplomacy has a preventive impact. And if something is done discreetly behind the scenes before it causes a major confrontation or conflict, where maybe go beyond just exchanging words, but then we're no longer talking about diplomacy if you go beyond that. So the attribute modern, well, OSCE, preventive diplomacy, this is actually, these are 2 words that go together and have been going together for the past 30 years, but I believe it's redundant, because diplomacy, per definition, has to be preventive, otherwise it's not successful diplomacy. But anyway, redundancies and attributes are, of course, something that we've been doing for many decades now. In the past 150 or 200 years, the Vienna Congress characterized or marked a new era of many new diplomatic tasks, multilateral negotiations, major conferences were initiated back then. So what are the 3 major tasks that diplomacy has to ensure in order to have a preventive impact, in order to reduce confrontation? And these 3 tasks are negotiate, represent, and inform. Those are the 3 major tasks, and it is about these 3 major tasks that I would like to talk about in light of the backdrop of how council meetings for foreign relations, these meetings are organized every 4 to 6 weeks, the RAB meetings. So what has been left, these 3 main tasks of diplomacy, and how is this handled in a medium-sized diplomatic apparatus such as the Austrian one? Now, let's talk about negotiation first, because negotiations should be the main task of the representatives of the diplomatic corps. So negotiations at the European level has been shifted to other bodies. It is a fact, and there's no need to talk about domestic policies in one of the 28 EU countries, but since the Lisbon Treaty, and even before that, there's been a shift of responsibilities from the councils of foreign ministers to the councils of heads of state and government. Now, what used to be done by heads of state and government together and in conjunction with the foreign ministers, namely to attend these council meetings together, in the past 20 years, this has shifted clearly in the direction of, well, reduction of power of the foreign ministers and an increase of power of the heads of state and government. And when I came into office and the responsibilities for the councils for general relations, there were, for example, the current still existing deliberations on the Brexit. There are no longer any negotiations taking place, but still deliberations. This is done in the General Council, then determining the multi-annual framework for the future budget of the EU. So these topics are being addressed. And no matter where in the EU 28, it is the heads of state and government that are in charge of that. And of course, in December of 2017, when we formed our government, that was also handled that way. So there was a transfer of part of the EU competences went from the foreign ministry to the office of the chancellor via minister in the chancellery. So I believe, objectively speaking, this had nothing to do with the then composition of the government or anything of the sort, but I think it was just a confirmation of what is happening and has been happening in all other 28 or the other 27 countries of the EU. So there's a strengthening of the position of the heads of state and government. This is where the main decisions are taken. On the 20th of June, last Thursday, this is also what happened. So what we're hearing through the media is the personnel debate, but currently I think that the personnel debate should not be the first and foremost issue. I think we should clearly be talking about the question of how to move forward with the budget. And we also need to work out various scenarios if on the 31st of October the United Kingdom leaves without a deal, and there are signs that point in this direction. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but if there is a hard Brexit, what's going to happen to the budget? And the membership contributions, those 40 to 48 billion euro that used to be contributed by the UK, what would this mean in terms of additional burden to be placed on the remaining members, and what would this mean for the multi-annual financial framework? So these are the main topics, and we also heard about this last week, questions related to climate protection, a change in the energy mix, and increasingly we are seeing also the heads of state and government discussing this issue, but it is not really within their remit. So the Lisbon Treaty lays down quite clearly that the energy mix needs to be handled at the national level. That, I believe, has been the wish put forward by important EU countries, because within the European Union there are diverging opinions that are held about energy policy, so that we cannot find a common approach for an energy policy. A very high percentage, I think about 80% of power in France is still generated by nuclear energy. And in Germany, there's been the phase out of nuclear energy, and in Austria, well, we have re-entered nuclear energy more or less. So this energy mix, the energy policy, is shaped differently, and I think this is something that the countries wanted to stay within their remit, and there's no way to break out of this, because I think there's a mental divergence when it comes to focusing either more on nuclear energy or on coal or coal mining, also in terms of creating jobs or guaranteeing jobs. So the social dimension, this is not discussed for the first time in light of the new and stronger priority given to climate change and extreme weather conditions. So I believe that this is something that we already discussed in 2006 when we had the natural gas transit problems. That had always been discussed at the European level, but hardly any headway has been made. So we need to negotiate, and this negotiation has moved from the level of foreign ministers, and therefore the diplomatic corps that is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this has shifted to the offices of the heads of state and government. And at the level of constitutions, this is governed quite differently in Europe. The French president has entirely different competences and remits and a different apparatus than, for example, a head of government in Germany or Austria. So one keyword, for example, would be to what extent a minister can give instructions, which isn't the case in Austria. I mean, the chancellor is not exactly at the same level as a German chancellor. So the heads of state and government have quite different competences and powers given to them by the constitution. They now have the major task of negotiating at the international level. One little anecdote that brings this to the point, just to show you to what extent for the past 100 years there's been a shift from diplomats who learned the trade of negotiating, and this has now moved to the heads of state and government. Around the season in 1919, the then British Prime Minister Lloyd George publicly said, "What do we need diplomats for? They're just a waste of time and money. We can do this ourselves." So this was a very clear admonition with a touch of, despising the diplomatic establishment. And back then, secret diplomacy became more well known. So especially Woodrow Wilson said that there's this terrible imperial colonialist secret diplomacy that we have no truck with and we want to nothing to do with, and it's best to no longer give the foreign ministries this competence and maybe leave it with the prime minister. So Lloyd George said, we can do this ourselves. And the others said just a waste of time and money. So what Lloyd George expressed by that in 1990 is something that 100 years later has, solidified. There's direct exchange, which often happens through party bodies, and maybe at the beginning of the 20th century this still occurred, in part at least, within other circles, be it through family connections, such as monarchies and their various family ties with other rulers. So some things could be settled internally, en famille, as it were, and today among heads of state and government this is also done at the level of parties and not at the level of parliament or at the level of the foreign ministries. So as far as negotiations are concerned, very little of that is still taking place at a diplomatic level. And of course there is still multilateral negotiations when it comes to negotiating major treaties, armament treaties, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, on the 14th of July 2015. It was signed here in Vienna, but on the one hand, there was foreign ministers that negotiated with each other, sure, but even more so, it was the technicians, more or less, the experts in the area of disarmament, and especially nuclear experts that were needed for this highly technical subject. So in order to come up with the JCPOA, the Iran deal, it's not enough to be a rotating diplomat who deals with a different subject every 3 or 4 years. No, we had experts. And these experts contributed their expertise, be it in international law or at the level of nuclear energy. So much on negotiating. Now, representing and informing the two other traditional tasks of diplomacy. So, what has been left, or how has it changed in light of the backdrop of a growing competition coming from other stakeholders who are also providing information, you can also represent, and especially when it comes to information, a lot has changed. And I'm not going to repeat some things that everybody knows about when we're talking about real-time reporting. So I've seen this as a diplomat in 1990, 1991, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, the diplomatic attempts that were running in the background. Well, the Austrian President Waldheim wanted to get the Austrians back from there, and Mitterrand flew there, so the French became involved. So there was a strong attention at the level of domestic policies and also on the side of the media, but the television channel CNN was much faster, so everybody put up a television set in every office. Back then we still had fax in the various diplomatic circles. So now, 30 years later, of course, this has turned around several times. And in light of the background of Twitter diplomacy, posting diplomacy, there is now a loss of a significant attribute that makes the work of diplomats and reports of diplomats so important, namely discretion, being discreet. So this has been returned to something quite unilateral. So to give an example, Henry Kissinger is quoted as saying that if there is something like Europe, I would like to have their phone number. Now, the phone number is the one of the High Representative Federica Mogherini. We all have her phone number. But the fact is, hardly anybody makes calls. Now, it is astonishing how little people are actually talking on the phone even today. So that is much more characterized by unilateral work. And this brings me to the actual meeting in the conference room in Brussels, a one-on-one meeting where the quality of a talk of representing the mutual interests in order to bring them to a convergence. And this has changed dramatically as a consequence of quite banal changes, because the level of attention has dropped considerably. There is simply no longer any focused presence in discussions and debates. It just doesn't happen. I was really devastated, and I am devastated time and again to see how much the little cards that people read from have replaced a discussion, a conversation. So of course you prepare your documents, you read the handouts and everything, but then as a foreign minister, but not only as a foreign minister, but also as somebody who is an accredited diplomat, no matter what area you're working in, you should be capable of voicing your thoughts independently and to speak off the cuff. This is something that would be considered a prerequisite in order to be able to be remunerated for this activity. So the art of conversation is gone. And I'm not talking about the high art of conversation, being able to speak in 3 or 4 languages correctly, but I'm only talking about having a normal conversation where you look each other in the eyes and where you actually respond to the arguments put forward by the other party. And I'm not going to continue my lamento, but when I took over and when I taught international law and international relations at the end of the curriculum, the course of studies, I organized a simulated conference where we could discuss an issue of international law or an issue of a general nature. So there would be a simulated conference where the students would act as delegations of various countries, and let's say there's a UN Security Council debate, or let's say a debate in the Council for Foreign Relations. And this is simulated by taking over the role of a delegation. You prepare correspondingly, you know what the national interests are, who are my allies, who are my opponents, and then in a playful manner you can prepare to negotiate and practice your method of negotiation. I try to make it clear to students you need to have eye contact, you need to be polite, you need to be friendly, and something that is really important, that's the way I learned it 30 years ago in Geneva and the UN bodies there, you need to be able to put things on an abstract level. Not everyone will 100% identify with the government that they are working as a diplomat for. That's the way it is. So what we were taught back then, as I taught my students as the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, has said, I would like to concur, etc. So you politely addressed the others as distinguished delegates. Today, we have reached an era where we are calling each other on a first name basis in the councils and not even there. And I think this is the wrong approach because we are not a family. Families can be something quite terrible, and you can't really give people the illusion that this is a big family. I think we need to state quite clearly that we are here as delegations, no matter whether we are working at the level of public officials or at the level of foreign ministries. We represent national interests of our economies, security, etc. So we're trying to find a convergence, and to reach this convergence of our interests, we should be like-minded. Maybe also work out a quid pro quo, tit for tat. I think this has been lost, and there's an illusion of that we have a seeming familiarity with others. So to what extent bilateral messages within the EU are still required, because there is this illusion that we are all big family and that we're all familiar with each other. And it is not with great pleasure that I addressed others with on a first name basis. So I would rather use the name of the country in question, because you never know who is in charge. It doesn't always have to be the foreign minister. Sometimes the foreign ministers come quite rarely, and if they're there, they're not in the room, but they use the time to have bilateral talks in the corridor. So you never know who's sitting there, whether it's number 1 or 2 of the various delegations, or whether it's the Secretary of State, or whether it is the foreign minister after all. So instead of using the first name, instead of giving the illusion that we are a big family, I would plead in favor of using the same style that we used for many decades in a very clever way to work at the abstract level of the state delegation, representatives of state. The king is dead, long live the king. So the organs of the state, the bodies. So these are the ones that represent their people. This should be put in the foreground. And we should not really focus on this amiable, familiar, very relaxed way of dealing with each other. So much on information and the many competitors that we have in the area of information. Well, I'm not going to refer to them, but it is a fact that sometimes long-standing correspondents of really good quality papers know more than the entire embassy knows. That's a fact. And it is also a fact that the often much praised think tanks and publications do not write their reports or their concepts the way the apparatus that they are intended for can use them based on the lack of capacities or due to the lack of socialization of the entire apparatus. So what think tanks work out by way of essays and studies often goes far beyond the reality of what an embassy with its consular obligations and its personal contacts here and there can handle. And of course, they need to represent the national interests, and they can do that better than the think tank ever could. Now, as far as representation is concerned, this is where we have a very permanent structure.
This is also due to the fact that in the last 100 years, we had a massive increase in residents. As many of you may know, that the area in the third Viennese district, the Belvedere district, is the district where most of the diplomats, the embassies are located. The buildings were built in the 1880s up until 1910, all in one go, basically. Also because of the disruption of the Metternich buildings inside, so some space was freed up, and so Metternich's private garden was lost. The embassies moved there, and this was the time when resident structures were established. These resident structures have their benefits, have their needs. Of course, in recent decades, we've also seen a massive growth of so-called special ambassadors, shadow diplomacy. One of the most famous examples of shuttle diplomacy was Kissinger, also Hans-Dietrich Genscher, former foreign minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, was also on the road a lot, and so the presence of ministers extended beyond their governments. So this brings us to the cost, and this includes parliamentary committees, ministers of finance, who will ask, do we need all of this? Is it really necessary? Can we close some of our embassies and reduce costs? And can we just use honorary consulates, which actually have one purpose only, honoris causa? But still, there is this reduction of resident structures, and depending on the country, on the individual case, the cultural hemisphere, you really have to take a very balanced decision. Maybe it's no longer necessary to the extent it was needed in the past to have such a structure in every state, especially if the host state maybe and its culture does not have the same importance anymore as regards the importance of being a host. But in some cultures, in some countries, such as in Austria, the culture of diplomacy is fundamental. I was fortunate to see in the recent years that as an exporter of culture, we are still something like a mini superpower, and this then allows you to maybe achieve a few things which you would not have achieved if even this part of foreign culture is outsourced and privatized, as has happened in some cases. So these are the main tasks: negotiate, represent, inform, and their development over the last 200 years. What is left of them? Where do we see the current challenges in terms of personnel, in terms of financial means? How do we overcome this apparent illusion of familiarity at EU level by maybe focusing on bilateral means? And the conclusion I would like to make, which could also be used for our discussion following my talk, is that in a number of areas we really need or have started a reinvention of diplomatic activity, which really brought us back to the original diplomatic structure by focusing on the state politics aspect, by focusing on the establishment of a state's interest and the creation of national consensus, by defining priorities, distinguishing between what's important and what isn't, knowing what should rather be dealt with on a bilateral level and what belongs in a multilateral sphere. Bilateral contacts have gained in importance in recent times. Personally, I found many of my bilateral visits much more interesting and useful than multilateral meetings, because the bilateral allows you to use the tit-for-tat approach much more to explain your interests in a clearer and much more coherent way than in a multilateral forum. Of course, a disarmament agreement such as the one with Iran, JCPOA, cannot be dealt with in a bilateral way. Back in 2012, Ahmadinejad was still president in Iran. Rouhani wasn't there yet, and at the time contacts with the United States had started. In the meantime, between 2005 and 2012, I talked to many diplomats, and they said only once the United States will enter into negotiations with Iran, the multilateral process will gain momentum, and that's what happened. JCPOA, with all due respect for the work and technical things that were done beforehand, but the major impetus was created by the talks with the then foreign minister Kerry. So it was a decisive bilateral factor which came into play. And this shows again that the bilateral approach only makes multilateral activities possible. So you shouldn't think that our world can only be covered in multilateral fora. Actually, there are signs that we are returning to a bilateral sort of world, be it trade talks, be it talks about reforms, be it reconciliation and crisis-solving attempts. This is it from my part. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your interesting talk. It's you talked about the 3 V's in German: prepare, negotiate, represent, and then of course followed by information. Now, based on the experience of former Federal Minister Karin KNEISSL, you could see that even at the beginning of her career, she was already involved in foreign politics and working in the diplomatic service between 1990 and 1998. And this career then paved the way for her function as Minister for European Affairs, Foreign Affairs and Integration in the last 2 years. Your talk and the fact that you referred to your experience that there is increasingly a situation in which people don't debate freely but just read out prepared statements. That's something we see in many areas of politics, this illusion of apparent familiarity, which shows that we will need to focus on diplomacy more again and on representations by the individual countries. This is something which you also mentioned. Before we start our discussion, let me just say that this discussion is also part of our conference on strategy and raises the question, is there strategy in diplomacy as well? So do we have strategies that are applied in diplomacy in order to achieve things? If you Google the word diplomacy, then what you will find is something like the art of forecasting things with 100% certainty which will never arrive, or to use 1,000 words in order to hide the true meaning of what you're saying. So that's also part of diplomacy. And the British diplomat once said, a good diplomat has to be able to see with his ears and to be silent with his eyes. And with this, let me start our discussion. Madam Minister, in preparing for this conference, we were trying to solve the following question. Diplomats and soldiers are selected in a very strict selection process. Training is important, but willingness to engage in political work, something is misunderstood also by colleagues in the political sphere which have not received the same kind of training. Yesterday we heard that Macron and Merkel proposed the establishment of a European army, and many people who have not received the same kind of training have no kind of understanding whatsoever for these kinds of suggestions. Would you care to give us your view on this? Thank you very much for your question. If I understood you correctly, then you seem to be afraid that this proposition by Macron and Merkel will lead to a technocratic development in the middle management level, and actual leadership will be lost. I think at last year's conference, which was on leadership, wasn't it? We talked about similar things. There's one thing I realized. People who are daring, who have a backbone, use their heart and their brain, and then use their own impulse, their own instincts, and don't wait for a general consensus to evolve and then only react at a later stage. These people are needed not just at the top level, but at every level. Because if you don't have that, you may have the famous leader at the helm of a ministry who, however, cannot trust his institution, the ministry below him or her. So, preparing future generations and colleagues also to be able to be daring, to be critical. When I talk to younger colleagues, I always try to also confer this aspect. And in the last 30 or 40 years or so, if I compare this to the diplomats I used to have as my superiors who have passed away in the meantime or are in their late 80s, but who were in decision-making positions 30 or 40 years ago, they were daring. They were sovereign or daring personalities at the time. And they were very confident. And that's what you need, because sometimes you don't have a very long time to take a decision. And they have to decide whether what they're presented with is a consular case or if it isn't. And in times of return of foreign fighters, these are cases that we are increasingly faced with, and I have to take decisions in these cases. And sometimes I have to be confident and take my very own decision. I cannot wait for headquarters to give me a few alternatives and give me all the input I need. I need the experience in life. I need the right instinct to be able to take a decision. And increasing the level of bureaucracy in this respect has a limited effect. In the last 10 years, in my opinion, bureaucracy is something positive, but still red tape has been exaggerated in the last years. We have too many technocrats, and we are missing the personalities, these confident people in diplomacy who were able to assess situations correctly and act correctly as a human being. And in the European External Service, we are trying to increasingly use people who come from diplomatic services and not so much from the European Commission. But currently the European External Service is not what I would call a diplomatic service. The gentleman in the blue shirt. Madam Minister, towards the end you emphasized bilateral talks in a Europe which is growing more united. Can't this lead to a situation in which the neighbors are suspicious? What are the two of them planning? Do you issue any communique after bilateral talks? Inform the other partners? Well, in the large group of the EU 28, it was only natural to also establish smaller formats. The most recent one, for which we don't have any legal basis at all, is the E3 format, London, Paris and Berlin. And it has emerged after the Iran talks, in which we had the P5+1, the permanent 5 Security Council members plus Germany. The US then left. China is a different story, and so the 3 Europeans were left. The E3 format, which doesn't have a legal basis but a lot of influence, and this E3 format can or might turn into an E2 format once Brexit takes place, for which we do have a legal basis. We have the Élysée treaties and the Treaty of Aachen, of Aquisgrana, which link Germany and France more strongly in their foreign policy efforts, and that's just one example. The Visegrad states are known. There are 4 states, so it's not bilateral. Even in the Visegrad system, there are new developments, and we might have something else than the 4 states. So it's only natural, it's in the nature of things that with a group of 28 you would also have smaller formats, and the one which links Paris and Berlin, of course, is the most important one. Now, as regards your question, of course, the others have to take notice of what is being talked in between the two. But as I said, personally, I found bilateral talks to be more efficient, and it's quite a different thing to spend 8 to 10 hours with your counterpart. That's what I did at the beginning of May with my Slovene country in a difficult situation. I know Slovenia quite well from my earlier activities, and personally it was very important for me to overcome this stalemate and start afresh with a new neighborly relationship. I'm not a friend of these 20-minute bilaterals at the silence of a UN Security Council where you meet in little boxes, just take a few photographs and talk for a few minutes. That's not diplomacy. It will only allow me to mention in my annual report that I meant where I met this colleague and that colleague, but we only had a few minutes. I can only really achieve things if I spend 8, 9, 10 hours with my counterpart in an atmosphere which will allow for substantial progress. And also, if you're a teacher, you cannot teach energy politics in a course of 40 minutes. You will need a week or 10 days in order not to just give a hint or a few general remarks about the topic. And the same goes for diplomacy. If I want to have a substantial development, I have to provide for the framework which will create the atmosphere which is allowing for these kinds of developments. We'll take one last question, Professor. Madam Minister, as political scientists, we try to use the toolbox of theories in order to open up some spaces in a political jungle. And sometimes it's reality which makes us suffer. You know both sides, you know science, you know politics. Where do you suffer from theories? Which suffering do theories cause to you? Where can you say this and that theory helped me a lot in whatever I did? And what are the examples where you say, dear researchers, sorry about that, my personal experience is completely different, spare me your toolbox. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Why did I love working with all of you here in this institution? Because it's such a pragmatic approach, and other than in political science events, it's a very specific thing. You talk about specific situations and challenges and what you can do about them. This is something that is different in military strategics than in political science, which is a young science. In my times as an active diplomat, right after university, of course, my theories wouldn't lead me anywhere, because you'd have to take a specific problem every time and then work on the basis of that. So that's what I said when I referred to think tanks. Their papers may be nice, but they just don't depict reality. The author of the various authors of the various papers don't know the limits we have in our day-to-day work. They can be banal limits. It can be about funds which are lack, the fact that we don't have trained personnel, the fact that a new minister comes on stage and has different priorities. So you need a lot of pragmatism. And I think it was Harold Wilson, a British diplomat, who left the Foreign Office in 1990 because he was disgusted, as he said. And he talks about what he experienced in the Paris treaties, suburb treaties. He said he was disgusted, and so he left the Foreign Office. He had the means, he had the interests to do other things. He was involved in landscape gardening, but he also wrote a book, a standard book, which I can only recommend to everyone who likes history of diplomacy, and it's called Diplomacy, first published in 1939. And then he writes, the worst diplomats are missionaries and lawyers. Everything you need for diplomacy is common sense. And I return to this statement many times in many situations. Theories and voluminous documents and papers won't be of any help. You just have to judge the situation as it is. Is my counterpart in a position or state to accept what I'm about to say? It's not just about talking about delicate matters. You also have to know if the day you're meeting is the right day of talking about things, because maybe in their own country they have a certain problem which has come up, or whether a conflict area has just seen new developments. I can not simply read my prepared statements. I have to be able to grasp the situation and understand with a lot of common sense and with my experience as a human experience, maybe the special approach I have vis-a-vis the culture and the person that sits opposite to in front of me, to know what I can talk about with them on this very day, even though you may not be very inclined to meeting them again. Thank you very much, Madam Minister.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Frau Bundesministerin, dass Sie uns die Ehre gegeben haben mit diesem Vortrag.
For
Diplomatie,
having agreed to talk about diplomacy, the will for dialogue.
meine sehr geschätzten
Ladies and gentlemen,
Konferenzteilnehmer, wir werden jetzt fortsetzen.
we will now continue
Konkret in 5 Minuten.
in 5 minutes
Ich darf also jetzt Ankündigung
with the next panel,
Strategie
which is called Strategy and the Natural and Technical Sciences. The panel will be chaired by Brigadier General Gerhard Fasching, and the following will be the members of the panel: Dr. Hinterstoißer, Dr. Fröhlich, Brigadier Teichmann, and Professor Hanus.
Ja, und gleichzeitig möchte ich noch hinweisen, auch
And let me also
das ist der zweite
tell you that we'll have a parallel panel in the KNEISSL,
Medizin.
which will deal with medicine. We'll start in a few minutes in this room.